With a combined decade of collegiate athletic experience, hours of unbiased research, and an uncanny ability to correctly diagnose your lineup, giving you weekly winning prescriptions, we are the Fantasy Sport Doctors.
Our goal is to become the leading podcast, educational site, and inside source for your daily fantasy sports. Currently, we are focusing our efforts on the National Football League with more sports to come in the near future. We are building a following of people who like to have fun, watch sports, and win money.
Hey, hey! Preseason. Dry run. All right, guys, this week we're going to be going over our format for the podcast so you guys can understand exactly what we're doing while we're talking about it. We will be uploading these Fantasy Sport Doctor podcasts on Thursday mornings, as we will be recording them every Wednesday evening. We will also be live from Periscope on Sunday mornings at 10 a.m., going until 11 a.m., and we will be doing a Stardom Situm segment. Basically, get on Twitter, tweet at us your questions. If you have like a PPR, Todd Gurley, or David Johnson question, which one you want to start or sit, let us know, and the Fantasy Sport Doctors will weigh in with our daily prescription for you. So let's get started. Every week, we're going to be bringing you the Fantasy Sport podcast. Normally, we're going to start it off with a subjective portion, which is going to be reviewing what we had last week and our picks from the last week. We're going to be going away from that for the first 2 weeks, as this week, obviously, it's preseason, and the first week we're not going to make picks for the week before. So the subjective portion will come in week 2. And all of our, what I'm talking about with the subjective portion is all of our podcasts are going to follow a SOAP note format. And every medical doctor or medical person or person in the medical field should understand what a SOAP note is. Basically, it stands for Subjective Objective Assessment and Plan, and it's what we write out at the end of every single visit. And all doctors do this, including medical doctors, chiropractors, dentists, like I said, basically everyone in the medical field. So that's the template that we are going to be following with this podcast. Again, the subjective portion of the SOAP note is what the patient is describing and what they're physically feeling. So to the Fantasy Sport Doctors, this is our picks, and this is the outcomes from the previous week. Basically, we're going to be taking a look at what worked and what didn't from the previous week and reviewing our previous picks. Then we'll move into the objective portion of the podcast. The objective portion is the SOAP note is the evidence that is found during the examination. To us, this means the physical data, the research, the Las Vegas odds, the defensive diagnosis. It's basically the information that gives you the ability to produce differential diagnoses. Next, we move into the assessment portion. The assessment portion of the SOAP note is the diagnosis of and the goal of the treatment plan itself. To us, this means physically breaking down players and matchups and putting those players in tournaments and cash games and who you should target in tournaments and in cash games specifically. Lastly, we have the plan portion of the SOAP note, which is what's actually been performed in the visit and what the plan going forward is. To us, this is the weekly prescription to win, which gives you the best possible player each week to pick for the best possible lineup. Next, I'm going to be sending it over to Dr. Nick Healy, and he's going to explain the objective portion, what we call the game chart.
Thank you, Dr. Nick Curry. All right, yeah, so I'll be explaining what the chart is. Basically, the game chart is a weekly breakdown of all 16 NFL games being played, using Vegas spread and over-under as our raw statistics. As doctors, we are taught to work smarter, not harder. This is the strategy that we have used with determining the best possible games to pick players from. Las Vegas odds makers have way more resources and research behind making the odds than anybody really knows, which is why we trust them to give us an accurate representation of which 6 teams we will be scoring the most points on a weekly basis. Basically, the formula is pretty simple. You take the over-under, divide it into 2, and add half the spread to the favored team to identify your total projected points for that team. For example, if the Patriots were playing the Bills, let's say the over-under is 50 points. With the Bills favored by 5, for some reason, take 50 divided by 2, add 2.5 to the Bills. That would be 27.5 projected points for that team. So our strategies, we're going to be taking players from the Bills because we project them to score higher points than any team provided. Next, I'm going to shoot over to Dr. Mitch, and he'll give you the defensive diagnosis.
Thanks, Dr. Nick. We are going to be using the defensive diagnosis in conjunction with some of our other protocols to give you the best possible lineups and matchups for the week on your daily fantasy sports. When selecting the perfect lineup in your daily fantasy sports, you need to identify the best matchups. The defensive diagnosis segment will consist of the top 6 teams and or players, and those players versus certain defensive schemes in those games, with which will be favorable to result in high outputs of fantasy sports points for specific players. A number of criteria will be considered when we do this: Vegas odds, player status and potential, trends and analytics, specific defensive packages, along with situational coverages. The defensive diagnosis will identify the disease in your thought process and give you the best remedy to fix it and then also win big that week. Okay, so we're going to head it over back to Dr. Nick Curry. He's going to talk a little bit about cash games, tournament games, and fight or fight response stuff.
All right, guys. So after we've done the objective portion, which is, again, breaking down the game chart and also the defensive diagnosis, kind of the hard stats. We then go into the assessment portion, which will be actively breaking down players we want to target within tournament games specifically and in cash games specifically. So there will be 2 separate sections to this assessment portion, each giving you a fight or flight response player, fantasy flatliner, and also the doctor's picks for the best tournament plays and the best cash plays during the week. What I'm talking about with a fantasy fight or flight response player is basically a fight or flight response is a sympathetic response, which is done to an outward stimulus. It's basically the body's way of reacting to something that's happening. Generally speaking, you go into 2 modes. You either fight what's happening or you run from it. You fight or flight. In fantasy sports terms, this is a player that is either going to go big or go home, right? Think of these players as sleepers or people who have low player salaries and high point potentials. Most winning lineups will have at least one fight or flight player included. All right. So next we have the fantasy flatliner. The fantasy flatliner is a player that has a high player salary and is typically viewed as a must-start player. However, when looking at the current matchup, his performance will not live up to that high salary value. Think of flatliners as a good overall player that won't live up to their potential on this specific week, a lot like busts. And remember, in daily fantasy sports, you're picking players on a week-to-week basis. So just because he's Julio Jones doesn't mean he's going to outperform Willie Snead. You got to pick the players that are going to perform the best in every given week. We recommend staying away from these flatline players as they are more likely to kill your lineup during that given week. Alrighty, next I'm going to be heading over to Dr. Nick Healy. He's going to finish up with the plan or the prescription to win.
The prescription to win, this is where you make your money. All right, our prescription to win is a template that you can apply to your own strategy to make the perfect lineup for you. The prescription to win is based off your own unique research and analytics. We start with the weekly Vegas odds on all 16 games, identifying the highest scoring teams of that week. We then apply our own defensive diagnosis done by the great Dr. Mitch Brecky to evaluate exactly which players will have the best odds of scoring during those games. The prescription to win should give you a good idea of what matchups to target. The players we expect to outperform what their salaries have, and affordably priced players to plug into your lineup, such as a sleeper like Dr. Nick Curry just mentioned. The prescription to win will give you the proper doses needed for your victory.
Perfect. So that is going to be the general outline of our podcast. Every week we'll be wrapping up with a few players that we really, really like, along with that prescription to win. Again, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're listed as the Fantasy Sport Doctors. That's spelled out FANTASYSPORTDRS, all one word. Look us up, follow us, like us, hashtag add us, whatever. Our first podcast is going to be going live as far as DraftKings, FanDuel, Daily Fantasy Sports. It's going to be up September 7th is when we'll be recording it, and it should be up on our site on Stitcher and iTunes on September 8th. That is the day football starts in America. Again, I am Dr. Nick signing off with the Fantasy Sport Doctors.